Good day to you, friends. Seamus here. Thank you for joining me today for a sweet little story about a good man and his dog. My thanks to all of you that have been liking and sharing our videos here and on Facebook and YouTube and so on. Thanks for subscribing and ringing the little bell. And for those of you that have bought coffee for me during this time, I really appreciate it. And the little Buy Me a Coffee now is down below in the credits. But let's just get right to the story. This is loosely based on an old fable of Aesop, and it is called simply The Mutt That Missed the Feast. Once upon a time, many generations ago, there was a good man that lived in a quiet village. And everyone in the village agreed that he was a good man for two very simple reasons. The first was that although he was the wealthiest person in town, he never held it over anybody. In fact, he was well given to hospitality and was the first one to help when someone was in need. But the second reason was perhaps the most important, and it was simply this: he loved his dog. It's just that. He loved his dog, and the people loved him for it. It seems that a few springs before, the goodman had been out for a walk about the village, as he often did, and he found himself down in the lower part of the village, which you might call the rough part of town. And he was walking around, enjoying the spring sunshine, nibbling on a loaf of bread, when suddenly, out of an alleyway off to his right, there came barreling a tiny little stray puppy, and it ran right into his leg and bounced off into the dirt. Well, rather than being angry, rather than yelling or lashing out, the good man just tore off a piece of his bread and held it down to the little pup and said, "Well, my, aren't you a handsome boy?" And off he went on his walk. And of course, we won't be surprised to realize that when the man got back to the back gate of his villa, he looked down and sure enough, the little pup had followed him all the way home. Well, he tore off another little piece of the bread and he offered it to the pup and made his way into the yard up to the back door of his house. And as he looked around, the pup was still following. And the goodman squatted down onto his haunches in the doorway and held out another little piece of bread and said, "Well, you've come this far, my friend. You might as well come the rest of the way." And he welcomed the little pup into his house. And later that day, after a good meal and a bath, the little pup was given a nice comfy bed off in the corner of the kitchen near the ovens where he would always be warm. And he became a part of the family, a member of the family. Well, it wasn't uncommon for the goodman from that day forward that when he went to the walk, he always took the pup with him. And of course, a few years later, he was a pup no longer, but a fine figure of a furry friend. And they would walk along talking about the important matters of the day. And it wasn't uncommon for the good man to ask the dog his opinion of things. And if the pup responded with a hung head and a bit of a growl, the man thought that was a bad idea. But if the pup danced around happily with a bit of a yip yip, he figured that must be a great idea. And on this day, he asked the pup, he said, "It's been some time since we've had a gathering. Do you think we should have some friends over?" And the pup said, "Yip, yip." And the goodman said, "Do you think maybe that we should have a feast for our friends?" "Oh, yip, yip, yip." And he said, "Well, if I know you at all, my good friend, you probably think we should invite the whole village in for a feast, don't you?" And of course, the doggy danced around and yipped and carried on. And the goodman said, "Very well, the decision is made. Let's go talk to cook." And they headed off back to the house to talk to the cook and the housekeeper about organizing a feast that would happen in just 3 days at the sounding of the evening bells, and the doors would be thrown open and the whole village would be welcome. And the goodman went out into the backyard to sit in the sun and enjoy the rest of the day. And he looked at the dog and he said, "You were such a kind helper to put this plan together. I bet you that you have a special friend that you would like to enjoy. You go right ahead and do that." And he put his head down and had a rest. Well, the pup took him at his word. And he very quickly took off and he ran across the yard and out the back gate and down the long winding road into the lower part of the village, down that same dank, dusty alleyway. And at the far end, he squatted down beneath an old storage cupboard where there was a pile of old rags. And in there was a strange, old, scruffy-looking, grizzle-faced, gray-haired cur dog, Mutt. And the little pup looked at him and happily started yipping and yipping until this old dog stuck his snout out. And the pup said, "We're having a feast at the master's house. Come up. 3 days from now when the bells ring. Come to the gate. I'll invite you in. You'll be my guest." And the dog's like, Whoa. I'm not going to any people's houses. People don't like me. They yell at me." And he said, No, you'll be my guest. It's the best of food and the best of drink and the best of the cheer. Come, yip, yip, yip. And the old dog said, "I'm not going anywhere near people. They always kick at me and yell at me." But the pup kept talking to the old dog until finally the dog agreed that 3 days later, at the ringing of the evening bells, he would come to the back gate and join in the festivities. He said, "And now go, leave me alone, I want to rest." And the young dog went on his way home, back up the long winding road to the back gate and off. Well, sure enough, 3 days later, as the sun was beginning to set and the evening bells rang, the old dog, to keep his word to the pup, got up and he made his way down the alley and up the long winding road to the back gate of the villa, and he kind of hung in the shadows of the corner of the gate, and he watched, and he could see people gathered around the back door. And suddenly, just as the bells ended, the people all went into the house, and he thought, well, the feast must have began. I don't know where my friend is, but there's no people, so I'll take a chance. And off he went through the gate and across the yard and in the back door of the house, and of course that led him right into the kitchen. And he stood there in the kitchen, overwhelmed by all the delicious smells. He took a big sniff. Oh, and it smelled so good. And he put his snout up on the table, and there was a big tray of freshly baked bread, and he breathed it in, and oh, it smelled so good. And a little further down the table, there was another tray, and he sniffed it. And it was a platter full of wine cups, and that smelled especially good. And then he went a little further down the table, and there was a tray with a big pile of fresh green leafy things on it. Some might call it a salad, and the dog took a big sniff of that, and well, he didn't like that very much. But the last tray at the very end, closest to the ovens, was a big platter of freshly roasted sausage. And our dog friend stuck his nose in there and took a big and he was like, oh, that's very, very good. And he thought to himself, well, the young fella said I'm an invited guest. So he reached up one paw, thinking to pull a sausage to himself. And just as he did, who comes stomping into the kitchen but the cook? Why, you rat-faced mangy cur, she said. How dare you come into my kitchen? And she began to stomp towards the old Mutt. And the Mutt panicked, and he froze. And that cook walked right up on him, and she grabbed him by the haunches, and she grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and picked him up and threw him right out the kitchen window, where he fell down into a large patch of wild roses. And all the way down through that patch, he bumped and he scratched and he pinned and he howled and he hit the ground with a yowl and a yip and a bark and a growl. And off he went running across the yard and out the back gate and back down that long, windy road, off to the end of the alleyway, where he dove under his hovel and hid for the rest of the day. Well, the feast was a great sensation. Everyone that was anyone was there, and that meant everybody in the village. But the following morning, when the pup woke up, when the young dog woke, he realized that something was missing. He hadn't seen his friend. As hard as he looked, he hadn't seen his friend. He'd gone to the back door. He'd even gone to the gate and didn't see his friend, and he was quite concerned. So down the stairs he went, and he went into the kitchen, where the cook called out, oh, good morning, my young furry friend. Your breakfast is ready. But the young dog didn't stop. He went right through the kitchen and out the back door and across the yard and out the gate and down the long, windy road into the lower village. And turning down that alleyway, he ran right to the hovel and dropped down onto the ground and looked in and called out to the old gray-faced Mutt, yip, yip, my friend, where are you? And that Mutt came out of the hovel. Don't you call me your friend. You invited me to a feast and I got beat up. Well, whatever do you mean? He said, well, I came. You said the evening bells on the third day, and I was there, and I saw all the people go in, and I followed them in, and the next thing I know, some great big mean lady was throwing me out the window. And the pup said, but you didn't wait for me. I came for you, and you weren't there. Never mind that. I got thrown out a window. Go away. Leave me alone. Well, the young dog wouldn't leave him alone, and he kept talking to him, and he kept apologizing, and how it was a horrible misunderstanding. If he would trust him one more time, he would make it all well. And finally, the old Mutt agreed. And down they went in the alley and onto the road and up the long, winding road to the back gate of the villa, and they stopped at the gate. And the old Mutt went off and hid again in the shadows, and the young dog gave a yip, yip, and the cook came to the door. Well, there you are, you silly boy. Your breakfast is waiting for you. Come on in now. But he wouldn't move. He just gave another yip, yip. And the cook said, now, come on now. I have things to do. Come and get your breakfast. But he refused to move. He just gave another yip, yip. And at that point, the cook leaned over her shoulder and said, someone called the goodman to the door. His dog's here, and something is wrong. Well, it only took seconds for the goodman to come, and he stood beside the cook. And as soon as he stepped into the doorway beside the cook, that young dog gave another yip. And up out of the shadows came the old Mutt, and he stood beside the young dog. And the cook looked at the good man, and she says, that's the mangy cur that was in my kitchen last night. I told you I had to throw some wild dog out. That's the one. But in that moment, the goodman remembered what he had said to his young dog. He had remembered offering an invitation to his fine furry friend. And he looked at the cook and he said, that's no mangy cur. That's no Mutt. That's one of our honored guests. And with that, he reached behind the cook, took up one of the cold leftover sausages from the night before, and made his way quietly across the yard to the gate. He broke off a little bite of the sausage and held it out to his dog, who took it, but then dropped it in front of the Mutt. And the Mutt, of course, gobbled it up. And the goodman broke off another little piece of sausage and gave it to the dog, who again took it, but dropped it in front of the Mutt. And the Mutt snatched it right up and swallowed it whole. And the goodman broke off another piece of sausage, but this time, instead of offering it to his dog, he reached out a hand and offered it to the Mutt. Well, the Mutt leaned back and cringed away, but the man didn't move. And he stuck his hand out a little further, and the Mutt growled a little bit and lowered his brows, but the man didn't move. And finally, in his patience, he watched as the old gray-faced Mutt stretched out and took that piece of sausage off his hand and chewed it down. Then the good man took the rest of the sausage and broke it in half, and he gave half to his dog and half to the old Mutt, and he got up quietly and began to walk back to the house, looking over his shoulders. And as he stepped up into the doorway, he turned and looked as the two dogs had come to the stairs, and reaching down his hands so they could lick away the grease, the goodman said, "Well, you've come this far, my friend. You might as well come the rest of the way." And with that, the two dogs stepped up into the room, and they shared the bowl of breakfast that the cook had put out. And later that day, after another very good meal and a bath, the old gray-faced Mutt was given a bed right beside the young pup, right in the corner of the kitchen, closest to the ovens. And you will not be surprised to learn that, of course, the goodman's dog and the old Mutt all lived happily ever after. I do thank you for joining me today. It's been a delight to visit with you again. Please come back about a week from now when we'll have another tale, something lighthearted, I certainly hope. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves and of each other. Feel free to like and share the video. Buy me a coffee if you like, subscribe, whatever you like to do. You know how these things work by now. But just be kind to yourselves and to those around you, and we will see you soon. Cheers.